I started working with black bears about 17 years ago, and I came at it from rather an unusual angle. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife management, and I'd hoped to go on to graduate school to do the kind of work that I'm doing today, but unfortunately I'm dyslexic. My grade scores and test scores were well below the norm, and I failed to get into graduate school. As a result, I went out to a trade school in Colorado and became a custom gunsmith and employed myself as a gunsmith for the last 30 years. I met my wife Debbie, who's sitting at the end of the table there at Colt Firearms, where I was working in the product engineering department. In 1982, we came back to New Hampshire, and I still had it in my mind that I wanted to do the kind of work that I wanted to do. I had a leg up on this kind of work because my father, Lawrence Kilham, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School, also studied birds as an avocation, and he wrote a book on the life histories of woodpeckers of the eastern United States, and a book on crows and ravens, and several other books on natural history, as well as publishing over 125 articles in ornithological journals on birds. So I had helped him growing up. I knew how to observe and what to do and not to do, and I thought that perhaps I should go ahead and try to do it myself. And my interest was in carnivores, and carnivores were a bit more complicated to study. My dad had a pair of binoculars and a small seat that he took into the woods, and that was the extent of his equipment. But I had to figure out how to get close to these animals. And I had a very simple idea. I thought that if I got a hold of an orphan animal, something I had experience with, because growing up my dad had all kinds of animals brought to us, starting when I was 2 years old and he was on sabbatical in Africa. He brought home a half-grown leopard that patrolled the house, much to my mother's chagrin. And since then we had everything from hawks and owls and woodchucks and foxes and so forth. So I thought if I got a hold of an orphan animal and raised it loose in the forest, acted as a surrogate mother to it, I could document its juvenile behavior and use that as a leg up on understanding adult behavior. And I was thinking about something I could possibly get a hold of through the licenses that were available. And at the time, my sister Phoebe and I became wildlife rehabilitators to that end. And I was thinking of perhaps a bobcat or a fisher or maybe a coyote. I hadn't given bears any thought at all. I thought they were too high profile, and there was no vehicle for me to get access to them, as in the state of New Hampshire there was no rehab of black bears had been done to that point, and that was it was up to the discretion of the Director of Fish and Game whether that was to happen. Well, as it turns out, a conservation officer brought me an 11-month-old cub that he thought had been hit by a car, and he was breaking a departmental policy by doing that, but it turned out that the cub had not been hit by a car, but it had a congenital disease. And the cub was quickly taken away from me because I lacked a license. But later that spring, the Director of Fish and Game called me up, and he'd heard about what my plans were, and he asked me if I'd take the bear back. And I got the bear back, and ultimately the bear had to be euthanized, and we found out what the problem was. But later that spring, Forrest Hammond from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife had 2 orphan cubs become available at a study at Stratton Mountain in Stratton, Vermont. And he had heard about what I was hoping to do, and he contacted me and asked me if I'd take the cubs. And I said, well, there's this little issue of a permit. And I said, if you can talk to New Hampshire Fish and Game and convince them that I should have a permit, I'd be happy to take the cubs. And the next morning I had a permit in hand. And so in that time we've raised and rehabilitated and returned to the wild over 85 black bear cubs. Tonight I'm going to talk about what I've been interested in, and that's basically the behavior of bears. And that was my primary goal when I started this. And my methods have been very different from the scientific method. I found that through my own experience, being dyslexic, I had tried for 40 years of my life to conform to educational standards and scientific methods, and I had 2 areas of experience, both in engineering and biology. And I was accepted at the Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth. Some of my customers in my gun shop were professors, and they'd seen, I have 2 U.S. patents, and they'd seen some of my work, and they said, gee, you really ought to go to the School of Engineering. We understand dyslexia today. We understand learning disabilities. And so they said, you'll have to be tested to prove that you have them. And so I got tested, and I discovered that I had an IQ in the top 1%, and I read at a 3rd grade level. And I proceeded to flunk all the remedial courses that they asked me to take. And it wasn't that I couldn't do them, it was that I did them all backwards. I remember I took a course in physics, and I understood the theory fine and could talk it with a professor, but I couldn't do any of the calculations. I took a calculus course, and I could mentally get the answers. The area under the curve, I just image a grid and count the squares and interpolate the edges and come up with a number. And that's how the computer did it, but it wasn't good enough for the professor in the tests. And the computer course that I took, I wrote a program at the end of the course, but flunked all the tests. And the professor never had a student write a program at the end of his course before. So my processes of doing everything were very different from what I was being asked to do. And my method of science that I do now, I decided after that experience that I was simply going to do what I was going to do my way and disregard any attempt to conform. And so I made up my own version of studying wildlife, and it's based on observation, experience, and what I call systematic modeling. And that is, my best information is the information I see with my own eyes. And it's the most consistent information I can get, and it's the information I can get the most rapidly. If I were to read, I don't read rapidly enough to make sense out of the information that I read. And the fact that the information that's available is of such poor quality that it takes a very good reader to make very good sense out of this pile of very poor quality information. So those who read very well can function on that level, but those of us who don't function much better by seeing the most honest information that's available, and that's what takes place in real life. And the systematic modeling is simply what we all do, trying to make sense out of things. And the difference is on whether one's good at it or not is how well they are at sorting out good information from bad information. And so with the information that I'm getting being, for me, good and consistent, I start making, everything in my world is a system. And all systems have to function. And for me, the behavior of a bear is no different than a component parts of a lawnmower engine. They're all made up of pieces. If somebody gave me a lawnmower engine just scattered out across the lawn, I, over a period of time, or you or anybody in this audience, could assemble them and make them function. And if you missed a piece, it wouldn't function. But you could figure out what that piece was based on the pieces around it and what was missing in the system. And so through observation, I started assembling sets and subsets, olfaction, vocalizations, different types of behavior, and at some point they start to form a model that starts to support all the other aspects of that behavior. And that becomes the system. And the system tests the observations to determine whether my observations are good or bad, because we all can make errors. This is how I've assembled the behavior of a bear. It's based on the bear's food supply. It's based on the fact that these female bears have home ranges that are evenly dispersed on the landscape, and their food supply is unevenly dispersed on the landscape. The food supplies are affected by the weather, frost, droughts, and so forth. And so in any given year, one female bear can control a ridge of oak with a huge surplus of food, and her neighbor may control an area of beech with no beech nuts at all. So her neighbor could conceivably starve to death if she didn't have a relationship with the female that controlled the area that controlled the oak. And what I found out is that all of the behavior of the bear, the way they communicate, their olfaction, every single aspect of it is about solving that problem of how to let all the members of the bear society have access to that food in that uneven distribution of food. And as you'll see in this talk, bears not only have hierarchies among themselves, they also have reciprocity with unrelated individuals. Females and the males form groups of unrelated individuals to access food inside the female home ranges. As I said, over the last 17 years, we've raised and released over 85 black bear cubs. And the cubs that I used to do my research were the very young cubs that came to me with no experience outside the den with their natural mothers. I acted as a surrogate mother to them, taking them on long walks up to 9 hours at a time and returning them safely to remote cages that we had built in the forest. With this experience, I was able to observe the very first reactions that these cubs had to their natural environment. I watched their tongues come out and stick to scent on trees. And that tongue coming out was lifting scent from the tree with their tongue and then delivering it to their bone marrow nasal organ, which is a small papilla inside the incisors of their teeth. Your dogs all have them. You can reach up behind their incisors and feel that little bump. All the carnivores and many other animals have a bone marrow nasal system. The bone marrow nasal system goes to the accessory olfactory lobe of the brain, and the nasal epithelium, or our nose, goes to the olfactory area of the brain. These are two different parts of the brain. The accessory olfactory system identifies scent, and then the olfactory system locates scent and learns from the accessory olfactory lobe. And so I saw very exaggerated behavior coming out of these cubs, but watching adults, you don't even see their tongue come out. It comes in and out so fast that it's you can't observe it. And so there was huge advantages of being able to take these cubs out. And I could experiment. I could go check scent at a bear tree one day that was hot and see the cub's reaction, and bring it back the next day to see the decline in action, the fact that another bear hadn't shown up. And I could perform all kinds of experiments while I was walking with these cubs. I raised 3 sets of cubs in this manner. Then the next step of my study was following some of these bears into adulthood and watching how they used these tools that I was able to observe as cubs under the natural conditions in their natural competition for food and social encounters with other wild females and so forth, wild bears. And I literally could hold a video camera between their front paws and film their tongues coming out as they licked up ants after biting into a log or a stump. This was a bear that I lost a few years ago in an unfortunate situation, a bear named Yoda. She lived until she was 5.5 years old and raised 1 set of cubs. The bear that I'm still working with and is still alive and has been in my book in both National Geographic films, or I should say all 3 National Geographic films and the Discovery film, is Squirty. And Squirty is now 15 years old, and she's raising her 7th set of cubs in the wild. She just recently gone to den with her 2 cubs that she has this year. She currently she has established not only a home range of her own. She was a bear that came from a population of bears 60 miles north of my study area, so I knew that she was distinctly unrelated to all the bears where I released her. She has not only established her own home range, but she currently shares her home range with 2 adult daughters and 3 adult granddaughters. And this is she has a matrilinear hierarchy, and she manages this hierarchy by chasing on sight any of the relatives that she shares her home range with. And within that greater home range, each of the females have distinct home ranges where they have the area to raise their cubs. So on site, this is Squirty. She'll chase SQ2, who's her oldest daughter currently, and she'll chase SNLO and 2, her youngest daughter, Brooke, her youngest daughter, and 2, and SQ2LO is the youngest of the pack. And on site, it's linear, so on site, SQ2 will chase everybody below her, and SNLO will chase everybody below her, and everybody chases SQ2LO. And this allows the bears to maintain the access to food within that greater home range, because Squirty has first access to everything. All she has to do is to stake her claim on the highest and best quality food that's available, and it's hers. There are no challenges to that. And so it goes down. So in a marginal food year, Squirty's likely to have cubs and be able to raise them. And down the line, some of the younger ones may not. They may have cubs and lose their cubs because of lack of milk and lack of resources. But in a good food year, all the females are going to have cubs and be able to raise them. Squirty also has a second advantage, in that when she first started building her home range, she had to do the social engagements with all the bears around her. And in July, I used to measure her girth, and in July she'd be at her skinniest, even though there was high quality foods available. And that's because she was having social encounters, chasing and contests with the neighboring females, trying to build and expand her greater home range. And every time she made an addition of space, she placed a daughter into it. So her daughters were very valuable. Now she's surrounded by daughters. She doesn't have to expend that energy anymore chasing these neighboring females. And she's able to carry weight from one season to the next, which also improves her chances of being able to produce cubs successfully. The managing of the hierarchy is done primarily by chasing, and chasing of different intensities. And this type of chasing is fairly ritualistic. They tend, at my study area where I observe them, my current method is going to a piece of property that I own that's about a mile off a town road, a dirt town road. And I show up in the evening and I'll give a small food reward to any bear that shows up while I'm there. So I'm only there for about an hour, so that's the window they have to show up. And it varies from no bears to sometimes 15 or more bears showing up, depending on the conditions of the wild foods. But I found that they're showing up not so much for the food reward, which is relatively meager because it doesn't affect their overall weight. The size of the bears in the hierarchy is relative to their place in the hierarchy, and you see the size decreasing according to that stance. But they eat first and then they chase second. And in this picture you see Squirty and SQ2, and SQ2 is right out in the open saying, "Come on, Ma, let's go." And she will antagonize her mother until the chase takes place. And this takes place in all of these. So they're fairly ritualized chases. They're fairly aggressive. They'll go up and around the clearing, and pretty soon Squirty will come back into the clearing and SQ2 will come right back in behind her. So it's all about maintaining those positions. Squirty doesn't tolerate any insolence from any of these females that she shares her home range with. She expects them to fold out of the way when she walks into the clearing. SQ2 is the only bear that I've seen challenge her, and it's been literally a false charge when they got too close, and Squirty straightens her out right away. I mean, it's an immediate response, correcting any kind of disrespect that she gets from them. Any of the young males that are born as cubs or come into these female home ranges get chased out immediately. The young males will tolerate a lot more chasing than an unrelated young male. And by young male, I mean males from age 2 to age 8. In this case, this is Squirty chasing her grandson. I watched him get chased, at least 30 times, and I know he got chased many more times than that. But finally in September, when he was nearing 2 years old, he left the study area and moved off into the greater population in the upper valley. The large males that came into the clearing usually showed up during the breeding season and right after the breeding season. Large males can take food from whoever they want. They don't have any problems doing that, but they weren't tolerated very long. After the breeding was over, they lasted maybe a week, and then they were asked to leave. And this is Squirty chasing Squirty's about 180 pounds, and she's chasing about a 250-pound male. I watched SQ2 when she weighed about 140 pounds do a stiff-legged walk back and forth in front of a 300-pound male, and he kind of backed up and sat in the bushes for a while, acting like you know, it's no big deal. I'm not really listening to her. But in the morning he was gone and he never returned. And the indication is the reason these males leave suggests that it's female choice in mating. And otherwise the males would take full advantage of these females and compete with them and their cubs in the home ranges. These large males are not evident in the female home ranges during the summertime. They go off and try to find sources of food, high quantity and high quality sources of food where they're not competing with the females. The surprise was that Squirty's right in the heart of her home range, the clearing that I work with her in, which is only females have access to without being pushed off. The surprise was there was a number of unrelated females that were coming in there, and Squirty would show no aggression towards them. And initially I didn't know who they were. I only knew that they were unrelated. But finally, with cooperation of the University of New Hampshire, I get DNA testing on them, and I found that this was a clan that belongs to this bear, who we call Moose. And Moose is about 23 years old. She's considerably older than Squirty. She was there before Squirty arrived. And all the other females that come in and share Squirty's inner circle are female relatives of Moose. And Moose is the bear that controls the area beach to the east, and Squirty controls the oak ridge that she's on to the west. And so this reciprocal relationship is interesting because it shows that these bears are cost counters, and they're having this reciprocal relationship with unrelated females, and this type of food sharing only exists in one other species, and that's humans. And cost counting is what we do every day of our lives. It's what dominates our life. Every social relationship we have, we're counting cost-benefit relationships of those relationships. And this reciprocity has been looked for in the great apes. And for me, it's not a surprise they haven't found it in the great apes, because it's likely that the ape that had it killed off all its competition, and there's only one of us left, and that's the humans. Social contracts. In order to maintain those reciprocal relationships, there has to be some type of social contract. I wasn't completely. I don't have any difficulty understanding and experiencing behavior, but I do sometimes have difficulty putting labels to the behavior that I experience. And it took me a long time to understand social contracts. I wrote about it in my book, Among the Bears, about how the cubs would manipulate us as we raised them. They would bite us, and they'd be nice to us to make sure that we raised them properly. And I saw a very clean parallel to that to human children, because for the first time mothers, it's the child who trains the mother through this business of pain and punishment, of completely misbehaving and then smiling and being nice. And the bears did exactly the same thing, yet all the dogs that I've raised don't have that behavior at all. They don't show any effort to bite us and control us and manipulate us. But I set up an experiment that duplicated an experiment done by Wolfgang Kohler in the 40s with chimpanzees, where I withheld food from the bears by suspending it on a rope out of their reach. And Wolfgang Kohler was looking for insight that might lead to tool use in chimpanzees. And he laid a bunch of boxes around to see if the chimps would move the boxes underneath the food to get the food. And that doesn't seem like much of an experiment, except animals tend to use their environment, not change their environment. So it took captive chimpanzees 3 years to move those boxes, to climb on top of them to get the food. And heaven only knows how much coaching took place in the process. But I knew that bears were insightful because I'd seen plenty of nuisance situations where bears can get food wherever it happens to be. If you want a bear on your roof, put food on your roof. Put your bird feeder up there and you'll have a bear on your roof. And so I wanted to see how insightful these bears were. And the first bear that came in Well, I had a remote camera monitoring the site, and the first bear that came in, this is Squirty in the picture, was her oldest daughter, Snowy. And Snowy got under the bag of food, standing up like that. She flexed her legs and judged that the bag of food was too high. And in the 2 minutes the camera was running, climbed the oak tree, grabbed the rope in her mouth, snapped the rope twice, and the bag broke loose, and she got the corn. The next bear that came in was her daughter, SNLO, and she was a scrappy 80-pound female at the time. And she stood on the box and leapt for the bag and missed it. And then she quickly climbed the oak tree and went arm over arm down the rope, grabbed the bag under her arm, and dropped down off the tree with a bag of food. And I was there when Squirty arrived, and Squirty and I have a different relationship than any other bear that I work with, i.e. I raised her, so she has access to me, and that means that she will bite me if I break any of her rules. And not all the other bears, I intimidate them. I have a natural dominance over the rest of the bears in mycelia. They're friendly, but they won't touch me and I can't touch them. But Squirty, it's a different story. And so I get the true bear experience of how she interacts with other bears from her. So when I arrived, Squirty came into the clearing and she stood underneath the bag like that and looked up at it, and then immediately went to the box and started biting big splinters out of the box and rolling it in the opposite direction. Then she went over to my remote video camera and started damaging that. She came back to my truck. She put both paws over the mirror of my truck, started rocking my truck, and looked up at me as if she could take the mirror off. And I knew she could because she'd done it on a previous occasion. I hollered no at her, and she responded and went back to the video camera to mess with that. This is all within about, again, 2 minutes' time. And then she came back to me. She did a symbolic bite at my knee, and then she bit me on the knee. And I produced the bag of corn. But I realized right then that Squirty and I had a social contract. That I had expectations of her. I expected her to wear a radio collar. I expected to be able to change it without sedating her. I expected to interfere with her life on a regular basis. I expected occasionally to bring in other biologists and maybe a film crew. And she expected the damn food to be put on the ground. And I realized that even though Squirty and I couldn't speak with each other in any language that was understood by each of us naturally, that we understood each other's expectations by each other's actions, and we judged each other by our corresponding actions. So when my actions exceeded her expectations, she punished me, and vice versa. And I went home that evening and I told Debbie, and of course Debbie's not too sure about this story, but I told Debbie what had taken place, and I said, you know, that's not a lot different from our own relationship. And she says, what do you mean? And I said, well, you know, in reality, you know, when any two people get together in a cooperative relationship, any two humans, you know, we fall in love. We don't know what's in each other's mind. We have no idea what's in each other's past. And the only way information we can get from each other is what we speak. And as we all know, that speaking is not necessarily the truth. That humans lie, and we don't always tell the whole truth, and we sometimes shade the truth. And so we ultimately, in managing our cooperative relationships and long-term relationships, have expectations of each other's behavior. And we judge each other by our actions. And if one of us exceeds the actions of the other, there's this immediate and powerful correction. It's called moralistic punishment in scientific terms. And that corrects any kind of behavior. And this type of communication is critical because for any relationship to last, there has to be good, clean, and honest communication. And we can be very harsh with our family because we have the ability to reconcile with those closest to us. And what Squirty did after she bit me on the knee was to go into a soft, repetitive moan of reconciliation. And this has happened every time I've broken one of Squirty's rules. And she has quite a few rules, I've come to find out over the years. And I always discover them by the hard way, by surpassing them. I had often wondered, male bears are much harder to study than females because they tend to have much larger home ranges. They can easily cover 100 square miles or more, and if you put a radio collar on them, they quickly go over the next mountain range, and you spend an awful lot of time chasing a ghost. And so I set up to monitor the other bears that were in my study area, so I wasn't just thinking I only had females. I set up a series of remote video cameras, remote still cameras to monitor the bears that were in the area. And in front of the cameras I put a small pile of corn, which was, again, a token amount, easily could be eaten by one bear. And what I found out that when there was a surplus, as in this case, this was an area of clear cut that was about a square mile that the productivity had gone way up in with an increase of berries and ants, bees, and grubs and beet hazelnut and things like that, and that it had remained productive for about 15 years after the cut took place. I found that there was a much higher density of young males coming into that clear cut. I had as many as 8 or 10, I could film as many as 8 or 10 different young males in a 2-week period after putting the cameras out. And this suggested that they had something going on that was allowing them to access the surplus foods in the females' home ranges. And the interesting thing was, when the year in 2008 I had the 8 to 10 males, 2009 when the clear cut was no longer productive, I only had the resident female. And so this suggested that they, that they're still a bear, they're just different genders. So they must have some kind of strategy for accessing surpluses. And it was when I had accumulated quite a considerable number of photographs of 2 males in front of the camera sharing that small amount of corn that I realized that these bears had friendships or male coalitions. So they joined as a band to come in and access the surplus foods in the female home ranges, because if they came in by themselves, the females chased them out. And I saw that happening on a routine basis. But when they came in mass, and by in mass I mean maybe 8 or 10 on a square mile, or maybe as high as 20 depending on the quality of food on a square mile, they could access these surpluses. And again, this type of coalition or group formation with unrelated individuals is something also that primarily exists with humans and not other species of animals. For all this to happen, these bears have to be able to recognize their relatives. And one of the things that I found was that if I had pictures of the mother and father of cubs, I could see the brown markings, the facial markings, distinct features of the facial markings on each of the cubs. And also, it wasn't unusual at all, like in these 3 female triplets, for them all to be marked the same, which meant that the marking was extremely dominant. And in cases of where there was more than one father, you might get two of the cubs that looked identical and then one that didn't look identical. And so the facial markings were a dominant gene. I've also been collecting scent samples over the years, hoping to run them through a mass spectrometer at some point, but the testing has been far too expensive to approach at this point. But I suspect they can tell their relatives through scent as well. Again, this is all about access to food. And in the spring of the year, the bears eat what I call emerging growth, as the buds turn into leaves and before the leaves harden off. There's a lot of nutrient available in the plants, and they're eating. They start out eating the big beech buds, and then the beech leaf starts, and the beech leaves, and in this case they're climbing a red oak tree and eating the leaf starts as the leaves first break into. The buds first break into leaves. They eat nodding sedge in the woodland trails. They eat the flowers of white ash and red maple, the buds of popple and the flowers. And there's a wide variety of foods that the bears eat this time of year. But the most important thing is all this food is evenly distributed across the landscape. And the later high-quality foods that will be available in July will be available in patches, and they will be unevenly distributed across the landscape. So the bears use the spring of the year for their breeding season. Female bears come into estrus from the last week of May and continue into, some of them in the estrus as late as the first week of July. And the male and the female bear will spend 3 to 7 days together while they're mating. And the female bear will return to her yearling cubs, and the yearling cubs will think things are just like they were and try to approach their mother, but things are no longer the same. And now when the cubs get within 20 feet of their mother, the mother will turn and chase them up a tree aggressively. And she doesn't determine who gets to stay if there's a daughter that needs to stay. It's the competition between the females that determines who gets to stay. The most dominant female will chase off the more subordinate siblings. The cubs will spend, after she's bred, she will fatten up and give birth to cubs that following winter in mid-January. After mating, it's a delayed implantation, and the result of mating creates a two-celled organism called the blastocyst. That doesn't implant into the uterus until late November, early December, and then there's a short gestation period of 50 to 55 days, and the cubs are born in the dead of winter in mid-January. They're born weighing less than a pound, nearly naked. Their little ear flaps are down and their eyes are closed. They continue to develop inside the winter den. They lay in their mother often lays with her hind legs out and encapsulate the cubs and thermoregulates them by opening and closing. They have access to the nipples on her inguinal and on her chest. They're not able to move or travel until she emerges from the winter dens in April. And oops, I don't have that on here. And they'll spend the rest of the summer with their mother and den with her again as yearlings. And then the family breakup will occur when the boar shows up in June of the next year. 85% of the bear's diet is vegetative matter, and the balance of their diet is animal protein. And of that animal protein, 90 to 95% is ants, bees, and grubs. And of the other 5 or 10% of their diet of the animal protein can be small animals. They'll occasionally take or opportunistically take deer fawns and moose calves, fledgling birds, and birds' nests. These generally don't affect the population. These animals have evolved together. The higher the population is of deer and moose, the more common the predation of moose, fawns, and calves are. I used to tell audiences that bears ate ants maybe 10 or 15 times a day, but one afternoon I was out with Squirty, and I'd watch her run her nose along a log and smell a colony of ants and bite into the log, and then quickly lick up the larvae and whatever ants got in the way, and then move on to the next colony of ants. And she was locating and cleaning out colonies of ants at the rate of 40 to 60 an hour. She was highly adept at this matter. And the other bear I worked with, Yoda, one fall she made her fall feeding strategy going after hornets' nests, ground nesting hornets or yellow jackets in the forest. And she was finding and cleaning out hornets' nests at the rate of 12 to 16 an hour. And she'd smell the nest from about 35 yards off. She'd go follow the scent of the bees back to the nest, and she'd go into the nest, and about 150 hornets would whack her on the face, and she'd shake them off. Woof. And then she'd start batting her muzzle, and then she'd go right in and clean out the larvae and whatever hornets got in the way. She'd casually walk off with a swarm of hornets over her head, kind of like Pigpen in the Peanuts cartoon. And meanwhile, her cubs would hit the dust and cover up all their vitals, as they weren't anywhere near as used to the stings as she was. Here's Yoda eating a raspberry or blackberry. Bears eat their food one piece at a time. When I was going in on the radio signals of these bears, I'd bring them a small reward of dog food, and it would take them 35 minutes to eat a small bag of dog food. If I offered that same amount of food to my Labrador buddy at home, he would inhale it in less than a minute and a half. The black bears, when they're feeding on beech nuts, will roll the leaves, and the little beech nut seeds will plop out as they roll the leaves up, and they'll grab them with they'll stick onto their tongue, they'll grab them one at a time. And nothing makes a bear happier than just sitting there feeding for hours on end, picking up very small pieces of food. The summer habitat of the black bear is in moist-rich soils around swamps, rivers, streams, and the lower parts of mountains. The summer habitat of the black bear happens to be where we build our houses. We've tended to build our houses in the valleys where the rich soils are. And the three primary foods or summer foods of the black bear are jewelweed or touch-me-not, which is a succulent, grows in everybody's yard in the spring. 3 species of wild lettuce, and the most valuable summer crop is jack-in-the-pulpit. And jack-in-the-pulpit is most valuable because it has a root or a corm that the bears eat from the size of a dime to the size of a baseball. And it's their primary root crop, and the root crop is not affected by the weather. And when they have good mast years, they tend to leave the jack-in-the-pulpit alone, but in the years when there's no mast, the jack-in-the-pulpit is fed on heavily. And it's this summer habitat of the black bears that bring bears and people close together. It's very common for our black bears to be feeding just outside our mowed lawns. We'd have no idea they were out there. We might have an old orchard behind our house with 3 feet of cover in it from interrupted ferns and other vegetation. And you'd never even know there was a black bear feeding out there unless you went and looked for the stompled trails and the divot left behind from digging jack-in-the-pulpit. You'd never know the bear was out there unless his little nose went up in the air and he smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has twice the calories per unit of any of their natural foods. And bears prioritize their foods by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. So in my experience, black oil sunflower seed is served up in quantities of 5 to 35 pounds at a time. So a black bear can come into your yard and get a day's pay in less than 15 minutes. Bears are known to be the pigs of the woods, and the reason they're the pigs of the woods is because they have to put on fat to get through the winter hibernative period and to give birth to cubs. The average bear, to survive its winter hibernation, has to put on 30% of its body weight in fat just to get through the winter. So they're storing their resources to get through that period where they have nothing. A female bear that's bred and that's going to give birth to cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to get through that period. So if you really want to understand why bears come around people and go and inconvenience us by taking our food, the primary reason is that bears act around food the way we act around money. We can store our money, we can put it in the bank for a rainy day, to fund our retirement, to fund our college education, but we'll do anything to get money. If you put $100 bills around your yard, scattered in the trees and in the bushes, I'm sure you're going to have some nuisance people coming along and trying to pick them up. The fall foods that are most responsible for putting on the fat the bears need to reproduce are the fall nut crops. Both Maine and New Hampshire have a combination of beech and oak. And oak is typically in the south and central areas, and beech in the northern areas. The red oak is the more valuable of the two because it's more productive. It generally has nut crops 3 out of 4 years, and the beech is generally on a 2 or a 3 year rotation. The red oak acorn doesn't germinate unless it gets hot sun on it. So the red oak acorns are viable and can be fed by bears the following year. The leftover nuts can be fed by bears as late as mid-July. The beech nuts will germinate early in May and will no longer be available for the bears after that. The amount of high-quality foods in the forest is directly responsible for how much trouble we have with bears in our backyards. The risk factor is big. Bears prefer to feed on natural foods in the forest rather than taking much higher risks coming in to get even higher quality foods around humans. And the amount of nuisance behavior spikes in years when there's natural food for failures in the forest. Dens, there's always a lot of interest in dens. We have quite a variety of dens in the Northeast. In this picture I'm crawling out of a den that Yoda used both as a maternal den and a den with her yearlings. It was excavated in an old root mass of a tree that had blown over many years before. Bears are not very good at digging through live roots, so they like exposed soil. And they were able to dig underneath this old root mass. And when I crawled into the den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots of the tree that was growing out of that pile of exposed soil. And that prevented the soils from collapsing down on her during the wintertime. They like well-drained soils. They're often on a small hummock or on the top of a rise, so they won't be flooded out in the spring rains. They use, as I say, a variety of dens. This is what we call an open ground nest. I know these are fairly common in Maine. Typically they're in dense softwood regeneration or softwood cover. This one happened to be in a hardwood clear cut. It was a bit of a surprise to me, but they're often, the bears nestled up against an old log. She'd bitten off the rotting wood to line her nest with. And she gave birth to her cubs right out in the open and chose the sunlight. She had made an attempted excavation about 50 yards from this site. They also use rock dens, and these rocks are just the pile of rocks that build up below the ledges over the years. For their winter den work, these give us the hardest time, because often these bears can get down into holes that aren't much bigger than their head. Their bodies are very supple, their shoulders aren't rigid like ours, and they can get down and out of the way and make it very difficult to do the winter den work with. Here's a yearling bear and her mother in a rock den. And the last form of dens that are in New Hampshire, and again these aren't very common, are in large trees. And I say they're not very common because New Hampshire and Maine have had logging histories, and the really large trees that are left are usually on boundary lines or in boulder fields where the logging crews couldn't get to them over the years. But when a tree reaches about 3 feet in diameter, the entire center of the tree can drop out, leaving a huge cavity inside these trees with only a thin wall of live wood. This particular tree was outside of a new residential area in Lyme. I got a call from a woman who said she had a bear outside her kitchen window, and I got there, and sure enough there was a bear outside her kitchen window. And it had denned up, it was in early April, and it had denned up in that large tree over the winter. The first set of cubs we raised, we had the dens a little too close to the sugar house, and the cubs got up early, and like most kids in Maine and New Hampshire, there was snow still on the ground, they wanted to go snowmobile. I really didn't mind them running the snowmobile all over the property, but every time I went to use it, it was out of gas. A couple of helpers in our maple sugar operation. Bears use wallow or even water frequently. They use it to cool off and to clean their fur. These wallows, the natural wallows that they use are usually vernal pools, and they're largely responsible for keeping these vernal pools open. You can see in this one the organic matter is filling up, and this whole thing would be going to a drier state had it not been for the bears going and using that wallow. They come out of the wallow covered with peat and mud, And you'd think they're awfully dirty, but as that dries off, it soaks up the excess sebaceous oils in their fur and leaves their fur rich and shiny like it is when you see them. But bears go to water frequently, and they drink a lot of water. So in dry areas, they can be found near water. Bears, during the mating season, the male bears will hang around these wallows hoping to hook up with the female bears that come in. And you know, there was a time in my life I used to hang around watering holes as well. When I was raising the cubs, one of the first things that I noticed was that all the green vegetation that they came across went into their mouths. And they would hold a leaf in their mouth very gently and then release it without doing any damage to the leaf whatsoever. And I wondered what this was. I called it a mouthing behavior. And when I started this process of raising cubs and studying their behavior, I had no great expectations. I was doing it for my own purposes. I was doing it because I had no access to doing this kind of work, and I was doing it because that's what satisfies me. That's what my background was, and that's where I wanted to be. And my dad had given me good advice. He said, don't worry about discovering anything new, because discovery by itself is just as rewarding. And so when I saw this behavior, and at this time in my study, I literally thought that everything that could be learned about bears had already been learned about bears. And so when I saw this type of behavior, the first thing I did was to go to the literature, down to Dartmouth to the library, and search this mouthing behavior to see what other scientists had written about it. And much to my surprise, when I did a literature search on juvenile behavior in bears, I only found 2 studies that had been done in the entire United States in the history of bears, and they had been done on captive bears on very rudimentary projects like food preferences in captive bears. And so I went back into the field and I started an immediate course on botany. I started identifying all the different plants that went into the cubs' mouths and looking them up, identifying them, and then keeping track of what took place. And over the first summer, I found that the cubs had been able to identify over 125 different food items simply by holding the leaves in their mouths like this, and then rejecting many, many more. The next question that came up was how'd they do this? I had a couple Brittany Spaniels at the time, and I stuck these leaves in their mouths, and they weren't very impressed. I put these leaves in my own mouth, and no bells and whistles went off. So what were the bears doing that was so different? And I contacted the local conservation officer, and I asked him if I could get a hold of a roadkill bear, and he provided me with one, and I did some rather crude dissection. And right under the nasal septum and above the roof of the mouth, where they've been holding these things, I found in a V-shaped bone called the vomer, I found a large fleshy organ about the size of a jelly bean. Now, I didn't know what that was either, because again, I started off from scratch. I started from just observing things. And again, I had to go back to the literature to try to find out what this large fleshy organ was. And there's plenty of literature on carnivores, because after all, dogs are carnivores. In veterinary medicine, there's lots of books on anatomy of dogs. And in there, I could only find 2 tubular-shaped organs called the vomeronasal organs. And they were said to be specialized in large molecules relative to pheromones related to mating. And so I proceeded by writing the people down at the Monell Chemical Synthesis Lab in Philadelphia who had written the articles on the vomeronasal organ, describing what I had found, and asked them if they had seen anything like that. And ultimately I sent them down samples of the organ that I'd found, and they took them over to the University of Pennsylvania Veterinary School and wrote me a nice letter back, and they said no such organ exists. But the result of it is that I believe that I've discovered an organ that is an accessory organ to the vomeronasal system that specializes in aromatic compounds used in the identification of plants, as well as long-term, long-range aromatic scent communication in black bears. Now, black bears are the only animal that I've found any evidence of this organ existing in the skulls of animals. And it doesn't exist in the panda or any other carnivores. And the black bears are the only animal that has long-range scent communication. All the other ones that lack this have long-range vocalizations. So the coyotes howl, and the wolves howl, and the chimpanzees pant hoot, and the pandas bleat and bark. But the bear's long-range communication is done with aromatic scent. The next thing I discovered was how a mother bear could teach her cubs what to eat so they didn't have to go through this trial and error process. And while I was walking the cubs, and very early on in the study, I was just flooded with behavior. I was seeing so many things happening, I couldn't make sense out of anything. All I could do was write it down. And every time while I was walking the bears, I'd get thirsty, and I'd go down on my hands and knees to a mountain stream to get a drink of water. And every time I did this, the cubs would rush me, and they'd make an audible sniff, like they were expecting some kind of information from me. And it took me for a while. It seems like I was pretty dense at the time, but it seemed like it took me for a while to figure out what was going on. And I got the idea that they were looking for some kind of chemical cue, maybe about what I was eating. So I did a little experiment. I went out on a log landing, and I got down on my hands and knees and started browsing on red clover, something I knew the bears hadn't experienced yet, and something I knew wouldn't kill me if I chewed on it. And when I did this, each one of the cubs rushed me and stuck their nose in my mouth and took a long sniff, and then immediately went out searching for red clover and started eating it. And so with this very simple experiment, I discovered three remarkable things. One, the cubs knew what I was eating was safe to eat because I was eating it. They knew what it was because of the organ in their mouth. And most of all was the speed at which they learned it from me, which was a sign of imitation. And imitation in the animal world is considered the highest level of intelligence. After all, that's how we learn. We imitate our parents. We do what they do. But unfortunately, we do the good and the bad of what they do as well. Here's Squirty with her young son, checking her breath to see what she's been eating. And this summer, Squirty gave us a surprise. Early this spring, Squirty came off the mountain with a single male cub, and in the middle of June, her daughter SQ2 during the winter, her daughter SQ2 had given birth to three cubs, two males and a female. And in the middle of June, I got a call from somebody who had property in SQ2's home range, and they had observed her with her cubs, and they said that two of the cubs were very vigorous and playing and wrestling together all the time, and one of the cubs was lethargic and not included in the play and often up in a tree and was lagging behind. And I explained that there was competition for milk, and it wasn't unusual if a sow had triplets that one or two would become larger because if they got more milk in that competition, and one would become smaller. And it also wasn't unusual for the one that got smaller to, a good rainstorm come along and it becomes hypothermic and it's gone. We try to keep 10 study bears with collars on them, and we've had several. Fairly often they'll give birth to 2 and raise 1, or give birth to 3 and raise 2. And so it's not an unusual event for a sow to lose 1 or more cubs based on the food supply and the amount of milk she's able to produce. But in the middle of June, she came back to the clearing where I meet Squirty for the first time. Both Squirty and her were wearing GPS collars at the time. And as I was leaving, just about dark, she was standing beside the trail waiting for me. I got out, and it was clearly something was emotionally up with her face, and she was trying to lead me off, and I didn't know what was going on, and I couldn't do much about it anyways. And so I left her a small food reward, and I drove off, and I didn't think much more about it. And the next evening I had to give a lecture, but I got a call from a neighbor who was a half a mile from the clearing, And they said that SQ2 had been in the clearing with two of her cubs in the morning, and in the afternoon there was a cub up a big pine tree bawling its head off for several hours. And then they called me back when they got back from dinner and said that bawling had stopped. And I said, well, these female bears know how many cubs they have, and they know what's going on. And I said, more than likely she came back and picked it up. Well, the next evening I got back up at the clearing, and I saw Squirty, and I saw a cub up a tree above her, and then a big male bear came into the clearing, and all of a sudden two cubs ran up the tree above Squirty, and I started getting confused, thinking I'd misidentified Squirty, which doesn't happen very often. And I realized that Squirty had that extra cub. And that night, an adoption had taken place that has lasted through the summer, and has been so permanent that all three of SQ2 cubs have been up the tree later on in the summer, one tree together, and the little female, who I call Josie, runs over to Squirty, and the two males come down and run over to their mother. And this is all signs that you would expect in a food-sharing animal, signs of empathy and altruism. And it's the only documented adoption in any animal species that I'm aware of, other than humans. The bears' cubs, while they're growing up, have a very aggressive type of play where they start on the ground with an open mouth wrestling and stand up and go into a bipedal stance, pushing each other back and forth. It's all done in silence. Many biologists call this mock fighting. I found it to be anything but. It's actually a social mechanism of friendship and food sharing. I filmed it in the wild with remote video cameras. I have one sequence where I have a small amount of food in front of a video camera, and a large male bear comes into that small amount of food, and while he's feeding, while the camera is running, a second large male comes in and honors his position by making a big loop around him, comes back towards him, opens his mouth, soliciting to share that food. They both go into an open mouth sequence. They stand up, they wrestle, and then they lay down, and they share that small amount of food in front of the camera. To have this type of complex reciprocity and food sharing, it's complex communication has to take place as well. As I say, with my method, all of these factors have to add up. There can't be any missing pieces or pieces that don't work. I spoke about long-range communication with aromatic scent. Here's Squirty receiving scent in the airways. She'll hold her head high and open and close her mouth. She's exhaling moist air out of her lungs, picking up the scent in the air, drawing it back through her olfactory system to analyze it. Unlike a dog who picks up scent in the air, it's usually, with my dog Buddy, it was the scent of a female in heat somewhere, and off he'd go. The bears respond emotionally to the aromatic scent in the air. They know whose scent it is, and they respond accordingly. If it's Squirty's mate that's coming, he may be 10 minutes out. She'll get this beautiful look on her face, anticipating his arrival. If it's somebody that she doesn't want to see or feels it shouldn't be there at all, she'll start false charging and swatting the ground, stiff-legged walk. Again, the bear is still 20 minutes out. Bears have facial expression, eye expression, and ear expression. All social animals have to be able to communicate with each other honestly and intentionally. It's our facial expression that allows us to meet in this room. We wouldn't be able to comfortably meet with this many people if we weren't comfortable with everybody's emotional and intentional state. And it's facial expression that is an honest representation of our emotional state. We don't understand this level of communication. Our emotional communication is done at a subconscious level. It was thought by scientists to be just unimportant relative to our language. It was first documented by Darwin 130 years ago, and it has only recently become back into the airwaves of modern science. If you go to a presidential rally and you see that Secret Service guy looking over the crowd, he's not looking for a gun. because if anybody had a gun, the president's dead. He's looking for one face that doesn't look like the rest of the faces in the crowd, because we can't suppress what we're thinking and how it shows up on our face. So the bears are easy to read once you tap into this emotional. Here Squirty has just put one of her daughters up a tree. She has an anxious and angered look on her face, and her ears are cocked back. They have similar meanings to those of a horse. She has a stern expression on her face, and then here she is coming towards me with a happy look on her face. And they have a wide variety of expressions as well. The expression of intention, now this expression is generated in a different way. The expression of emotion comes through the central nervous system, and as I said, is honest. The expression of intention can be bluff and deception. This is generated consciously and mechanically. So now the bear will chomp its teeth, it'll huff, it'll swat, or it'll false charge. All of these expressions of intention, they have a limited means of ability to communicate, and the meaning is based on the context of the situation. So if you meet a female bear on the trail and her young cubs have just treed and she false charges you, she's trying to delay confrontation long enough for communication to take place. She's not trying to, we take it literally, we think they're going to eat us, but that's not the case. And if you're working at a restaurant and you're taking a pail of food scraps out to the dumpster and a bear false charges you, he simply wants you to drop that pail of food scraps before you put it in the dumpster. And I was with Squirty one afternoon up on a ridge in Lyme, and it was a beautiful sunny day, and this thunderstorm came rumbling up the valley. Squirty false charged the thunderstorm. And believe it or not, the thunderstorm turned and left and the sun came back. But the bears have a wide range of vocalizations that fit into this category. They control their young, and they get them to follow them and come down out of trees and manipulate through difficult passages by gulping and making a little chirp. And they have a sound that literally says stop and no, and you shouldn't have done that, which is a ho. But they're all mechanically generated, and they have a varying amount of intensity, and the intensity reflects emotion. And this is how I've been able to live and work with these animals, because once you figure this out, you don't have to get in trouble with them, because they're going to tell you when you're about to get in trouble with them. Bears are able to follow each other to find food and to follow each other to punish. And any food-sharing animal, any altruistic animal, has to have a judicial system. They have to have a means of punishing the cheaters. And the bears have a much better judicial system than we do. We think that fingerprints and DNA are wonderful things, but we got to get them off the perpetrator. A bear just smells who did it and goes after them. Here's Squirty lifting scent off an object. Again, she's expelling moist air out of her lungs and then drawing it back through her olfactory system. Bears also are deliberate markers with their olfaction. Now when they are deliberately marking, instead of using the aromatic scent that's coming out of their sweat glands, they're using the large molecule, low volatility scent in their sebaceous oils. And in this first picture, you might argue that this bear is not intentionally marking by ducking under that sapling and letting it ride across her back. But this is a different bear, the same sapling, and her strategy is to grab the sapling and run it over her back like this to make sure she gets all the scent she possibly can on it. And all the chasing that takes place in establishing hierarchy, at the end of the chase, the female bears do what I call a post-encounter marking, and this is done primarily by the females. And again, they have a limited means of marking, so they're typically the full back rub in the top two pictures and walking over sapling in the lower picture. When they walk over a sapling, they literally walk over a sapling, letting it drag across their underbelly, picking up sebaceous oil, sweat, urine, or semen, and then it flips up like an olfactory antenna and lets the wind carry that scent around. But this marking is done to let the bear they just chased or put up a tree know who it was that chased them, just to let them know who the truck was that just ran over them. And this, because most of this type of chasing takes place in a 2-month period of July and August, once this hierarchy is established, these bears expect all these other bears below them to honor their scent marks. So that they'll now find a group of oaks that have a higher density of acorns on the ground, and that will be theirs, and they don't expect any competition there. And they don't expect to have to spend any energy after that point chasing to protect those resources. The most common way that bears in New Hampshire get together during the mating season is at these red pine trees. The red pine has the highest amount of aromatic compounds in its sap of any of the trees in New Hampshire. I notice there's some cedar here in Maine. Cedar is probably used as a secondary tree, but bears prioritize all the trees based on the aromatic qualities of the sap. A male bear will back up against these trees and do a full back rub, depositing his scent on the tree. And then he'll rotate his head and bite the tree. He bites the tree to advertise his mark because it is of low volatility. And so the female bear, who knows who she wants to mate with, will show up at the tree. She'll rub on the tree and wait nearby. He'll come by and pick her up. And then they'll head out of Dodge, because when she comes into estrus and is about to ovulate, her condition is advertised on the airwaves. And during the mating season, all those bears age 2 to age 8 will be satellite males, following the big males around with their females. And if there's bears of equal size, sometimes there's a challenge, and sometimes the females lose their mates to a bigger male. So as the female, wherever the females go after that point, the male that's with them will establish a 2-acre breeding territory around her. So if she comes into your yard, you may see this guy back rubbing and biting on trees in your backyard. And here's a male bear that's traveling with a female with a full back rub, and then biting the tree, and then looking pretty happy. When I was doing this work, I got interested in the panda, because the panda was the only of the bears, even though it's a very primitive bear, that lacked the organ that I discovered. So I got permission to go to the National Zoo to do some experiments with scent, and it took me 1.5 years to get permission to go there, and ultimately I got invited to the Chengdu Panda Base to present this talk to the Chinese, who have been captively breeding pandas. They're hoping to put some of the pandas that they've been captively breeding back in the wild, but they don't have a clue about how to do that. But I had read all about the pandas. I'd read all the books and the literature I could find on them, and I still didn't really understand what this critter was about until I went down and I met it. And when I met it, I was stunned, because here was an animal with no facial expression, had no ability to move its ears, and its eye expression was masked with these big black blobs over its eyes. And when I saw and read about the social behavior of the panda, they were truly a solitary animal. Their food is bamboo, and bamboo grows everywhere. They live in about a square mile of bamboo. The social relationships they have are with their offspring, and once during the year, or once every 2 years, when they mate. They have none of these cost counting and social relationships with unrelated females or unrelated males. And they probably have social hierarchies between males and maybe between females for access to the best food. More recently, I've been deploying GPS collars on the bears. The first collars that I deployed were collars that I built myself. This data was Squirty traveling with a male for 4 days during the breeding season. My collars were putting out 1,400 points a day. I had to make 2 collars and change them every 6 days on Squirty, which fortunately that only cost me a few Oreos each time I did it. But these red marks were the last day of mating after they'd bred. She took them on a trip of 12.2 miles, and she went outside her home range into the neighboring female's home range checking out food supplies. And I was able to document this on 2 different breeding seasons, and she did the same thing in 2 different areas, taking advantage of the 300-pound gorilla she had with her as a coalition. And since then, I've had the experience and have had many calls during the mating season of female bears coming into people's yards, just going all over the place, checking things out. I was sitting in my house one day, and we have a deck, and we hadn't had a bird feeder out since winter, and this female bear came walking up the deck and went over and checked out the grill, checked out the bird feeder, and I said, well, he's got to be here somewhere. And I looked out on the bank, and there he was, the big male sitting there. But females take advantage of having the male to check out risky situations that they wouldn't check out by themselves. We now are trying to run 10 bears with GPS collars, hoping that I'll get a better understanding of using what I've learned about behavior from getting this hard data of what they're actually doing. The study that I do with the 10 bears is a cooperative study with New Hampshire Fish and Game. To end up tonight, I have a quick visual sequence I call Houdini's Apple Tree Olympics, so hang on. And finally is dismount. Thank you very much. Has questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yeah, way up and back.
I was wondering if you've ever seen a bear that you know communicate that connection to a bear that you don't.
Go ahead, say that again.
Have you ever been out with a bear like Squirty? Have you ever seen a bear that you know, like Squirty, communicate that connection to a bear that you've never seen?
Which connection?
That you have a relationship with Squirty.
Well, yeah, that is communicated, but it's communicated by imitation, because when I'm out there, I'm able to walk freely among Squirty and all her family. And during the breeding season, these males that come in, I've never seen them before, and they come right in like they've been there the whole time, and I know them personally. And some of them are a little more standoffish, and some of them just don't care at all. And I know comfortably that they're seeing my relationship and copying that relationship, just accepting the trust that's there between Squirty and I, and transferring it to themselves, because one would expect they'd all run away if that weren't taking place. But that's usual. I mean, I'm non-existent. They go about chasing each other and all their social interactions without paying any attention to me whatsoever. Yes.
Well, when she bites her knee, you're still walking. Is it just a gentle little thing, or?
Well, blood comes out sometimes, but the punishment is commensurate with the crime. And Squirty, on the same time that she's bit me, she's also defended. She's backed off big male bears that have been in close vicinity of me and told them to stay away. So she's protected me at the same time, and that's why I say it's a social contract. It goes both ways. There's gratitude there. There's protection. There's punishment, and it's very, very similar, to life among humans, except it's different. Yes.
Is there any year-to-year fidelity between the mating pairs?
I haven't seen anything. Squirty's mated with 8 different males. One year, the male that she chose got bumped by a bigger male, so there's been one more male than she's had cubs. And the males don't, at least in my area, they don't. I might see big males for 2 years in a row, but rarely more than that. So the males themselves are changing in the area. Males really get to travel all over the place, and because they're only going to mate with the same female once every 2 years if they did stay in the area, and the likelihood of them just ending up somewhere else. And there's obviously competition and hierarchies that develop annually in every area. So the same male might get moved on and be more successful somewhere else. But males, even during the breeding season, travel widely and will approach many different females, hoping to develop a relationship. Yes?
I thought I saw a picture of you once standing in the water with 2 young bears teaching them to fish. Did I see that, or am I?
Doesn't sound familiar. We don't have enough fish to teach them to fish, but.
Okay, so you don't take them in the water?
But basically, I really didn't, even though the film sometimes said I was teaching them. The primary thing that I did with these bears was I gave them an opportunity to learn, because without me, they wouldn't travel anywhere. I found that they had developmental stages in which their home range size grew based on how old they were. And so when they were 6 months old, they stayed within literally 2 acres of land and wouldn't leave that unless they followed me out. And by at 9 months old, it might have expanded to 6 or 8 acres. And then at 10, 11 months, when there was fall nuts came, it was about 20 acres. And then in the spring of the year, when they were 13 or 14 months after hibernation, it suddenly went to 100 acres. And then by the time they were 18 months old, it was all the outdoors. And so I saw a developmental change as they mature. Yes?
You said that Yoda had met a sad fate, and I wondered if that was too sad a story to tell.
Well, it was sad because she was shot, but she was shot intentionally by people who knew she existed and people that I knew, and they were devious about it, and they paid because the whole community came down on them, and they left town out of shame. But you know, they lied, and you know, it was an ugly situation. But they may well have, they went in and targeted her with the precision that they probably were using telemetry to access her. They shot her at her winter den and put a drive on. They did it in snow, so we knew what took place. They put a drive on either side of her den and shot her there. So it wasn't a pretty situation. But they paid dearly. Yes.
You say you've raised and released like a large number of bears to the wild. Are these all bears that you've released further away from where you are? And if so, would you say you would still have a level of relationship with them that you do with, say, Yoda or Squirty?
The question was about releasing the bears. Did we release them near or away from where we are, and would I have the same relationship as I have with Squirty? We release bears. I work closely with New Hampshire Fish and Game, and we release bears all over the state. I've only worked with 3 sets of young cubs, and they were the only bears that I had that relationship with. Most of the cubs that come in are aged 5 months to 11 months old, or even 16 months old if they're in bad enough shape in the spring. We use a single caregiver, and we have an 8-acre forested enclosure that we raise them in. So they develop their own social groups, and they become very good at taking care of themselves.
So would you say it's possible to still get that level of relationship with a bear that's older, or would it have to be from one that you've raised?
Oh, you can actually, the level of relationship takes place in people's backyards all over the United States and Canada, because bears, because they're food shares, they think highly of those who share food with them. And if there's enough people feeding bears with bird feeders, bears become so tame and so accustomed to people. I mean, there's many cases where people actively feed bears and have them climbing all over them and things like that. But the problem is that bears, the social contract business is that once you start feeding a bear habitually, you have to do that continually, or the bear is going to punish you. And these bears often come into people's houses, and ultimately you end up calling fish and game departments to settle the score because you can't handle the results. The bears will make sure that you continue what you start. And that's where the problems begin. The nuisance bear is a bear that's become habituated. and they become habituated quicker than any other animal because they're food sharers. I say it's kind of like inviting your brother-in-law over for dinner and he stays for a month. Yes?
This past summer, I had two encounters, a couple months apart, with a family of 3 cubs and a mother. The second time I saw them, the mother started emitting, moans and groans, and then there was a buzzing sound, and I haven't been able to find out if anyone, do you have any thoughts?
Well, make it. I don't know what you mean by buzzing.
I mean, it almost sounded like a, I know it wasn't, but it almost sounded like a chainsaw in the distance. It was kind of like a,
Well, they do a lot of things which I mean, I've seen Squirty go, and I mean, there's a lot of hissing and things like that they do that I don't generally put into their major vocalizations, but they're capable of making a wide variety of short-range sounds. So unless I heard a recording where you could duplicate it, it's hard to know exactly what she's doing, but she's probably letting off air or moaning in some fashion.
Well, it was almost like she was kind of disappointed I had left.
But often it's a huff when they're complaining about you there. It's when a chomping of teeth and things like that, and that's a nervousness or a huff, or they're protecting your back. As I say, all these things have multiple meanings based on context. Yes.
You mentioned false charges several times. How do you tell if it's a false charge or a real charge?
Well, the question was, how do you tell if it's a false charge or a real charge? The reality is they don't real charge. And they're going to give you all this other stuff that goes along with the false charge, the chomping of teeth, the huffing, and I call it generally displaying or complaining or moaning. All of that stuff is so that they don't have to have an engagement with you.
What are we supposed to do?
My advice is to hold your ground, keep your eyes on the bear, and talk softly to it. And the reason you hold your ground and you stay in position is because any animal that's under stress or is fearful of you will want to dominate its fear. And the best thing to be is always be dominant. You want to talk softly because all animals recognize that emotional range from harsh sounds or aggressive sounds and soft sounds or appeasement sounds. So you want to let it know that you're dominant but not a threat. You can keep your eyes on the bear because they're not like chimpanzees or dogs. They're not part of a hard hierarchy. A dominant chimpanzee or an alpha dog won't tolerate any kind of insurrection from one of its below it in the hierarchy. But bears on a regular basis are interacting with strangers. So they're willing to negotiate with you. Bears are the only animal that I know of that read our emotional communications better than we understand them ourselves and will act accordingly. I've been in close contact with more than 30 females and young cubs. I've been false charged, I've been circled. When they circle you, they simply want to know who you are. They want to smell your back trail. And then they'll come back to their cubs, and if you stay relaxed and keep composed, talk softly to them, within a matter of 10 or 15 minutes, they could care less about you. I've spent 2.5 hours filming bears that I've never met before after being false charged and circled. As far as I know, they're the only mammal in North America that are capable of this type of determination and ability to read and then act upon what they're seeing. But what you don't want to do is go gaga, to lose it, to have preconceived ideas that if you get between the sow and cubs, you're going to get eaten. All of this garbage we carry with us gets us in trouble. I try to train people to read the behavior of the animal and think about the context of the animal. A sow and cubs is out there making a living. She's not planning on running into a human and eating him that day. You know, she has nothing to gain from it. You know, she doesn't have Medicare, Medicaid. She doesn't have anything to keep her out of trouble. So you always want to de-escalate the situation. And there's bad advice out there. There's advice that if you see a bear, yell and scream and make yourself large. Well, you scare those cubs, she'll go exponential. But the reality is that these bears are highly tolerant. We send millions and millions of unprepared people into the woods every year without incident. And you're encountering bears, I'm sure many people here have encountered bears. And we can do all the wrong things and still come out of the woods. So it's very, very rare for something to escalate into an attack. And when that happens, it's because the human has done something desperately wrong. Because you can control the bear by controlling your own behavior.
And when you said keep your eyes on the bear, are you saying eye contact or?
Just with regular old straight face.
Is
I
there-
mean, you're not trying to
is there-
challenge them. You're not trying to say you're tougher than they are. You're just looking at them.
For you, I mean, I noticed a difference in the cat mine, but it was grizzly, but we've talked about this similarities with Bill. I did notice a difference with the bears that I had eye contact with, and if I just, like you said, kept my eyes on them, but didn't have that eye contact.
Well, you're not trying to stare them down. You're just kind of keep them honest. Again, you don't want them taking advantage of your weakness. If you turn and run, their tendency, any animal's tendency, a dog's tendency, another person's tendency, you wouldn't get in a bar fight with somebody and then turn your back on the guy you're fighting with.
But I mean, as far as like locking eyes versus you're saying. a
Well, I'm not
soft-
saying locking eyes. I'm saying normal face, keep your eyes on. And your eyes are your most powerful defense in any situation. The only time I would get a stronger approach is if there was a bear that was showing some dominance towards me. And for him to do that, he'd have to lock eyes on you and try to override you and then walk towards you. And that would be what a bear would do that was being aggressive. But then your best defense is to just outstare him and hold your position.
So direct contact.
Yeah.
That's it. Okay.
Yes.
How do you deal with bear hunting season, radio collar bears? Do you have some way that you can advertise your research bears? And
Well, I put signs up that say, ask people not to shoot collar bears. We still have accidental shootings, which I just deal with. I mean, not everybody's going to be able to tell. Intentional shootings is an entirely different story, and that's what we dealt with Yoda. There are boneheads out there who, think a trophy bear is a bear with a collar on it.
but it's not illegal to shoot on a
No, but and you couldn't control it anyways. There's no way you could write a law that would guarantee that everybody could identify it. So you just have to live with it. It's one of the things I knew that going in, and I have to live with it. So.
One other question: Do you find that bears that have food source, say acorns through the winter, do they den the whole winter? Do they come in and out?
Well, generally speaking, the bred females will go to den first, and the females with cubs second, and the males, as long as there's a food supply, will stay out. We've had mild winters in New Hampshire with abundant acorns, and I've had reports of large males out every month of the year, and coming to bird feeders every month of the year. But generally, it's about availability of food. In years when there's no food, no mass, they all go to den early.
Did the cubs that you raised from young, when they came to the first winter, did they show any signs of wanting to hibernate? Or
The cubs hibernated all by themselves. They didn't have any trouble deciding to do that, and they had all the instincts that were necessary to hibernate. So we didn't have to withhold food from them or do anything else. If we put the food away from them, and their point would come when they no longer wanted to get their feet cold and wet to get it. So.
did you help them out with setting up a place where it would be suitable for them to?
Yeah, we did, and now I just make dry brush piles and put covers up, and they select where they want to den inside the forested enclosure. They generally all den together because they conserve heat that way. Yes?
It was interesting to see how elaborate their plant identification is. Do you ever see them seeking out psychoactive plants at all? Have you noticed them enjoying it?
I don't know. I don't think they communicate quite that well yet. But I didn't find any evidence that they ate mushrooms at all. And that was interesting because I spoke with a biologist out west who claimed that the grizzly bears ate mushrooms all the time. And then he told me about a grizzly bear that died and its belly was full of mushrooms. So I'm not sure about. I didn't have any evidence that they could identify them, and I offered them to them, both poisonous and non-poisonous mushrooms, repeatedly, and found no evidence So if they were to learn them, they'd have to learn them culturally. They'd have to learn them from their mother.
Do they ever forage in the intertidal in the ocean at all, or are they much more land?
We don't have enough tidal. Randy, this is Randy Cross from Maine's. He's one of their bear biologists.
Intertidal, I haven't actually heard of any foraging intertidal, which is kind of interesting because we would think that they would.
It's a good source of food. It's just out in the open. I think they do it in Alaska. I think that's, you know, but they're down there eating salmon at the same time.
Maybe one of the big things in Maine is that the coast is so heavily settled, and bears got moved back 150 years ago.
Yeah. Well, you know, I get asked about fish runs all the time. I mean, we put dams on every river, so we've destroyed all our fish runs. I'm sure that prior to the time when we started building dams, that there were good fish runs and there were black bears feeding on the fish runs. Yes, way up in back.
I was just wondering, in northern and eastern Maine, the deer populations are very down now. Is that the same with the bear, or is the bear seeing a resurgence in their population?
I'll let Randy Cross answer that one as well.
The deer population is affected by 2 severe winters, and bears then during the winter, so the severity of the winter tends not to affect the bears. In fact, they almost seem better sometimes when there's no deeper for the bears, just for insulating them. They're not affected by that. So.
Or coyotes?
No, coyotes are too big of a factor in mortality.
Take a couple more?
This is Ed. I thought I read or heard that up in Labrador, bears were found more along the coast than here up in northern Maine. It may be a population thing.
Well, it could be the people too.
It could very well be, and some of those with black bears, you get the idea from listening to Ben too, is that the mothers pass an awful lot on to their offspring, and so you could almost look at it as cultural perhaps, that once you eliminate bears from the coast where the white men first landed here 400 years ago and tried to grow their crops, then, you know, you've eliminated that culture. The coastal culture may be gone, you know, and there may have been a coastal group of bears that foraged on the coast that were eliminated totally.
Yes.
How do the cubs who don't have the teachings from their mother compare to the other cubs that are taught by their mothers?
Well, one thing that we found, and we've seen the outdoor forested enclosure, which we've been running for about 10 years now, we've seen a big difference in survival once they go into the wild population relative to the hunting kill. And inside that, they have the ability not only to exercise, but to form social groups and interact with wild bears on the outside. And what I'm seeing, we keep these bears until they're 18 months and release them into a population of dispersal cubs. And these bears they so easily make friendships, and we've documented these friendships almost immediately after these cubs are released. They pick up very, very quickly. In fact, I've had young males leave for 3 weeks and come back doing things they weren't doing before they left. You know, they're suddenly building elaborate beds at bases of trees by raking up leaves and things that I just hadn't seen before. I can't prove that they learned it from another bear, but it's pretty obvious that they got it from somewhere. So I think there is I've seen significant signs of imitation, which means that and the fact that they are able they have all the social mechanisms to interact with strangers, they very quickly assimilate into the wild population, unless they're completely lacking those social tools. Yes?
Do you believe that any of your observations would be valid with grizzlies or Kodiak bears or other species?
I think these observations, many of them are valid. I think the whole basic concept of food shares goes through all of the major bear species except for the panda. Their key behaviors like the open mouth wrestle and the friendship wrestle that exist in all those bears. The difference between all those bears is based on the niche or the environment in which they've adapted to. And so the grizzly bear is a bear of the open grounds and is more of a carnivore than the black bear is. And of course, the polar bear is different, and the sun bear and the sloth bear, and They all have their adaptations, but they all share a key group of common behaviors. Yes?
What about cub, killing of cubs by adult males? How does that fit into this?
Well, I have some evidence of that, and the best scenario that I've been able to see is that in marginal or poor food years, if a female bear doesn't put on enough fat and gives birth to cubs and can't produce enough milk to raise those cubs, as soon as she runs out of milk, she's automatically going to come into estrus, and the breeding season is in June. And I have evidence of females still having cubs with them, cubs of the year with them, when the breeding season comes on. So when she runs out of milk, it's automatic that she goes into estrus. So that attracts males. And she's either going to abandon those cubs or she's going to expose them to the males. Now the males easily can be mercy killing the cubs because they're not going to survive. They're much smaller, they're weak in condition. Usually some of them have already died off by that time. Those same males could get the idea that if they killed a healthy sow's cubs, they might get her to breed. The problem with that idea is, one, I've watched squirting when males have approached too close, and it's not a pretty sight. Squirty's all over them like a swarm of bees, and they're out of there. And the second problem with that scenario is if a male bear actually was successful at killing a healthy sow's cubs against her will, she would come back into estrus, but there's no guarantee that the male that killed the cubs would be able to breed with her, because there would be open competition to mate with her, and she also would have some sense of who she wanted to mate with. So evolutionarily, there isn't a lot of sense in that. But the killing of a cub, of an orphan cub that doesn't have a mother, I found that orphans, as long as their mother's alive, have the power of the mother. But if the mother's dead, they have no status at all. So there's no repercussion in killing them. And all these bears behave according to what the rules are. So it's not likely that if a bear actually killed a mother's cub, she'd be wanting to mate with them. So there's a lot of confusion there. We like to elaborate on it because it does happen. It's obviously not a problem with evolution, because evolution's been a long time. Yes?
What, if anything, do you hope to gain from your work?
What do I hope to gain? And initially, I just wanted to do what I wanted to do. But it's blossomed into a lot more than that. I think that we need to know more about all the animals that we exist with. And there's been recently a lot of interest in how I do what I do. And the fact that we're taught in schools a certain method, and not all of us are born to do that method. And we wonder why the schools fail, why only 30% of the kids go to college. That means 70% aren't being taught adequately in our public education system. And so I gotta wonder that, I tell a story. I was on the State Advisory Committee for Special Education in New Hampshire, and I lectured to them about the very subject in my experience, and they asked me why they would lose kids at age 5. And I said, well, it's quite simple. I said, at age 5, when a kid goes to school, the teacher says to him, he says, what are your plans in life? What do you want to do? And the kid says, well, I want to grow up, be successful, raise a family, and be able to support them. And the teacher says, well, how are you going to do that? And the kid says, well, I've got a plan. He elaborates on his plan, and then the teacher says, well, sorry, Sonny, you got to do it this way. And right there, the rug's pulled out from underneath the child. And so I can't help but believe that, with genetic diversity, which all plants and animals have, there isn't a wide range of abilities in human nature, and a wide range of how we learn and perceive the world. And until we recognize that, we're not even treating ourselves well. So I think that's probably the greatest accomplishment I can make, is to make an impact on how we educate ourselves.
Well,
Yeah.
I think, one more, and then you want to give people time to get books and so.
I just wanted to say, over a month ago, we had a bird feeder visited by a bear, and we were just wondering what you would
when the bear comes, take your bird feeder in for the year.
For the year.
For the year.
We've been taking it in at night. and
Doesn't do
now-
the trick. The bear comes and he says, geez, where's the rest of the food? And there's a scent trail to your house.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, well, it's a long time, but you know, we share the environment. You're feeding wildlife, you're not feeding birds. And you know, there's a lot of other wildlife that comes into the area. And often, you know, they're under pressure. Sometimes bears are relocated and things like that. But their community, their life, and their everything is right where they live. And the very best we can do is to accommodate them. And we need to make the accommodations. We're smart enough to do that. And the reality is the only reason that we feed birds is because we're affluent enough to feed birds. I went to Russia at the first international rehab conference a number of years ago, and the Pashlikovs were raising Russian brown bears and releasing them from their facility, and there were no nuisance problems at all in the area. And the reason was the Russians were so poor that food was still valuable to them, that they used every scrap of food. They had 50 of us there, and they fed us a big dinner that first night. At breakfast, half of that dinner's leftovers were prepared for breakfast, and so the week went. At the end of the week, there was nothing left over for scraps, and I'm sure that was taken home and fed families. And you know, we're just a very affluent economy, and we don't think anything of the value of food, and we leave it everywhere. And we also have great expectations. You know, the more we get, the more we want. We're like our children, and so we have to at some time think about and just make the accommodation. It's simple to make. When the bear comes, just stop. Because that bear, if he goes to enough places, is going to end up getting in trouble. And it will be destroyed one way or another. Generally, it's some homeowner will pot it because it's just broken its rules. But the bear is just doing what it does naturally. And you can't have a forest. Our forests run out of food. These bears, throughout evolution, have adapted to living without food during times of shortages. I've had cubs come to me 11-month-olds weighing 9 pounds, and you give them food and they suddenly turn into a bear. A bear can go through hard times. We watched 2 years in 2003, 2004. I've never seen so many skinny bears. But it's kind of like you going on a diet and somebody putting a pack of Oreos on the counter. You're going to nail that pack of Oreos and then go back on the diet. And the bears know that we have food laying around, and they don't come until they're in trouble. And so we've just got to be more understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you.